So, welcome back to another revamped video. This was originally my third video that I made, and now I'm coming back and doing it with the camera. And today's episode is about censorship in World War I. Now, censorship has been a part of almost every single war since the dawn of time, to some degree or another. And starting in World War I, you really see censorship tick upwards a lot, like an extreme extent. And then, you get to modern day and censorship is still pretty heavily enforced, but then you have Wikipedia that periodically goes crazy, linking, classified information all over the place. And it's, millions of files. And then you have snipers in Ukraine texting each other on Instagram, insulting each other because they happen to know, this sniper is in my area. I'm going to rage bait him and send him a text. And then you have some National Guard member from Missouri who thinks that the tank in his video game is just slightly inaccurate. So he goes and he links classified information. Now, most of these are not in times of war, but when you are in war, it suddenly becomes even more important to censor your soldiers to the highest degree. Now, in World War I, censorship was a lot easier compared to what it is today, because today you have phones, and in seconds I can send a text saying, what the plans are of my unit, if I was in one, saying that we're going to move out tomorrow and we're going to go here. And I can send that text to whoever I want. And then I have leaked, classified information. The censorship has gone out the window. But in World War I, when you are so remote that you can go weeks and weeks without hearing any news, censorship suddenly becomes a lot easier because everything gets passed through either word of mouth or letters. And then you have newspapers, but those get censored to a completely different extent, like even more so than what we're going to talk about today. And especially in France, where you can be 400 miles away from the, front line, or about one length the state of Kansas, you truly could go weeks without hearing the news, which made censorship just so much easier than, what it is today. Now, there's a handful of things that you would broadly want censored, and it really comes down to what nation you're fighting for, when you're fighting for that nation, and what the censorship looks like at that time period. 1914 censorship was a lot easier to get by. 1918, they have a whole unit dedicated just to censoring people's mail. We'll cover that too. But broadly, across every nation, you would want these things censored, like positions. If I send a letter to somebody and it says, I am fighting at Verdun, and that letter gets intercepted, and the Germans somehow get that letter, well, then they know, oh, well, he's fighting in Verdun, so this unit must be at Verdun. And we know, how old that unit is, how that unit works, ergo, they know information that they shouldn't. So you wouldn't be able to talk about your position at all. You could give broad statements. I am in South France. I am in France. I am in the, Mediterranean, maybe, but you wouldn't be able to say, I am at Cape Helles in, Ottoman Empire. Can't say that. You wouldn't be able to talk about movements either. If somebody was to send a letter that says, I am leaving Verdun to go to the Somme in April of 1916, and that letter gets in the hands of the Germans, well, then they know, well, they must be preparing for an assault on the Somme, because there's no reason why they would be taking troops off of this point and moving it to this point if they weren't amassing for an attack. And then if that letter gets home anyways, and word gets out that my son is going to the Somme, and then that person says, this person's son is going to the Somme, and it, plays a game of telephone all the way, well, then that news can still get out. You also have plans for the same reason, kind of as movement. If it gets intercepted, it's not a fun time. If that news gets home, still not a fun time. Death was a big one. You couldn't really talk about deaths, not just in your unit, but just on a broad scale. You might be able to get away with a person, but that could be censored pretty easily. And it would definitely be censored if you said, my unit of 12 people all died. There's nobody left. because if that message gets intercepted, then the Germans know, okay, well, we're doing something really effectively here if we just took out an entire platoon of people. And even if that letter gets home, it could be even more disastrous because then they know, oh my God, everybody in his unit just died. And your war support just bottoms out completely. And if enough of those letters get home, you will lose your war support very quickly. So that wouldn't be allowed either. Same thing with injuries as well. It's really fading out on me. Same deal there. We don't want to talk about injuries, not only for the enemy, but also for the people back home. And then a big one is talking about peace, criticisms, not just of the army, but of people in your unit, especially superior officers. And this talking about, you should go riot in the streets and rally for peace could legitimately get you in trouble. Like, not even just censored, like legitimately land you in hot water, trials, the whole 9 yards. So roughly, you wouldn't want to talk about these things. And again, there's a bunch of other things that you wouldn't want to talk about as well, but pretty good broad list here. Now, on the screen here is a translated letter from a German soldier in 1914. And the lines that have a line through them is what was censored out of that letter. It is a significant portion. And for those that are just listening, I'm going to read the letter with what it says before the censorship and what it says after the censorship. So German going to the Russian front, so the Eastern Front, in 1914 sends this letter back home. For 8 days now, the cannons have been thundering in front of us, the fresh volunteers against the Russian positions. Because of the cold, which in spite of 3 shirts and waistbands shake our bodies, because of the forced marches, because of the bacon and bread that stands in for warm meals, because of long sentries at night in which the ice-cold wind brings tears to our eyes, we are being forced to think about ourselves and to be candid about our situation and our burdens. The old reserves who have already been through heavy attacks throw friendly and encouraging looks. Now, that letter shows a horrible reality. They are freezing cold. They are obviously not prepared for the cold because they have 3 shirts and waistbands and are still freezing cold to the point of shaking. They are going on forced marches, so clearly they are reacting violently to something. They have no food, not enough adequate food at least, because they are surviving on bacon and bread that's standing in for warm meals. And they have these long sentries at night in which they're still freezing cold. And they've gotten to a point where they are actually thinking about their situation and thinking, this isn't all it's cracked up to be. If that letter got home, that could absolutely cripple your war support. That could put some absolutely atrocious ideas into, civilians and families back at home. Now, with the censoring, the letter reads more like this. For 8 days now, the cannons have been thundering in front of us, the fresh volunteers against the Russian positions. The old reserves who have already been through heavy attacks throw us friendly and encouraging looks. Now that letter is a wildly different letter. That letter shows, they've been fighting, and there's, thundering from the cannons, and the old reserves are still alive. That's good. And the old reserves are friendly and encouraging. That's good too. So it can't be that bad. And that's the power that censorship has. It can completely warp your view to angles that you can't even imagine. And in World War I, it was highly effective. And it really doesn't become not effective until you get to the era of the internet, when you can post all of these things online, as they're happening. It is absolutely wild how effective censoring can truly be. Now, this image is fascinating. This is the pinnacle of military censorship. The people that came up with this were legitimate geniuses. This is the way that hundreds of millions of pieces of mail managed to get from the front lines back home. If you have a standard letter, somebody has to go in and read that. But with this, they take a look on one side, they flip it around, they take a look on the other side, and they just send it on its way. And it's free for the soldiers as well. This is a field postcard. On the other side of this, you would write down your name and then the date and then the address, and then you would send it off. That's it. On the other side, you would fill out this card, and you would cross out what does not apply. And what was left that wasn't crossed out is the full message. You couldn't write anything else on this. If you tried to write anything else, it would just flat out be destroyed. There was no censorship because there was nothing to censor on these if you followed the rules, because this was made by the military. And the British used this, the French had it, the Germans had it, the Austro-Hungarians made like 600 million of them throughout the war, which is insane for a country that couldn't even supply its own troops in almost any other piece of equipment. These were so incredibly helpful. So in this letter, he is quite well. He has not received a letter recently. He has received letters somewhat recently, but not, a long time ago. And he's doing fine. And that's the whole letter. You would just send that back. It's just like a little quick way of, sending a letter back home that says, I'm alive, or I'm injured, but I'm in the hospital and I'm, alive, or hey man, send me a letter. And that's what the bottom part would be. That's it. And they were just so incredibly effective at just giving these quick little messages back home. Now, there is another way that some nations would censor themselves. You have, that first way where you just have like a letter back home that gets read. You have the field postcard, which we just talked about. And then you have self-censorship. And self-censorship was extremely widespread across almost every single army for a handful of reasons. The first one is extremely high levels of military pride. For a lot of soldiers at, just the enlistee level, this is the first time that they have left their towns. For some of them, it's the first time they've had a stable job. For some of them, they signed up because they saw the super cool, Kitchener's Army posters. And they would do nothing to, imbalance the protection of that army. And to them, anything that could harm not just themselves, but their brothers in the army or the army overall is just incomprehensible. So they wouldn't do it. So they would self-censor. They would know what they could and couldn't write. They just wouldn't write it in the first place. Now, the second reason is they knew that they couldn't get anything past the censors anyway. And if they were caught trying to get something past the censors, if it was egregious enough that they could be in legitimate trouble, and then they could be, court-martialed, they could have extra work duties, who knows what it could be. But they didn't want to risk it. And then the third one is that they just didn't want to disturb their families back at home. Because if they sent a letter back home saying, I was standing in a trench today, and a shell went off 10 feet down from me, and the shockwave kind of came down the trench and knocked me out, that doesn't instill confidence in your family back at home, believe it or not. If your parents get a letter that says, I almost died today, they're not going to be like, oh, he's alive. They're going to be like, oh, he almost died? That's not good. So in order to protect their families from what was going on, they would self-censor themselves as well. Now, you have all these different reasons, and this worked pretty well. You still had letters getting censored if they were handwritten, but a lot of the times you had the self-censorship that would stop that before it ever even got written down. Now, there is a fourth method, and this was not in every army. This was a some army thing, but it was definitively a British army thing. Now, these are honor envelopes, and they would skip part of the censorship process, and we'll go over that in a minute. But they were written down on this green paper. That way you could very easily distinguish them, put inside of an envelope, and then sealed. And it would skip your local censorship where anybody you know might be able to read it, skip straight to the broad censorship where somebody that you have never met before in your life will read it, and then be sent home. And this letter was pretty secretive in what you could write. It was a little bit more relaxed, and you could write to your family about something that was more private, that you didn't want anybody in your unit or anybody near you to know, except for the person receiving the letter. Now, there was one catch to this honor letter, and that was you had to put down your name, your rank, the whole 9 yards, and then you had to sign on the bottom left of this your signature saying that you promise not to write anything that you shouldn't write. Like, you shouldn't write anything about where you are or anything that's going to happen, because when you are skipping that local level of censorship and you're going straight to some civilian sitting in a warehouse, you might be able to slip something past them because they don't know exactly what's going on either. So the ability to get certain messages past them increases with this. But if they catch you, they will come after you. Like, this is a court-martialable offense. They will find you and you will be in big, big trouble. So it was a trade-off of, I will sign my name saying that I know I will be court-martialed if I try to slip anything past them, but that means that I have a little bit more secrecy compared to the rest of the people in my unit. And these were sent out not all the time, but they did play a pretty important role when it comes to censorship and sending letters back home. Now, who's doing the censoring? Because I keep talking about they. They are censoring the letters. Okay, like I sound like I'm going crazy over here. It's them. They are censoring. And when I say them, I mean multiple groups of people, several places down the line, are doing the censoring. So if you are a British soldier sitting in a trench, your letter will typically go through 2 major screenings. And then you have a third one as well. We'll go over that. But basically, you're sitting in a trench. You want to write something to home. And you sit there, and the first line of censorship is yourself, right? Like, you write your letter, you leave out some details because you know that you don't want that going back home. And then you hand that letter to your commanding officer. And your commanding officer gets everybody's letters being sent out that day. And then he goes back to his dugout and he reads every single letter. And then he sits there with an ink pen or just a trash bin, depending on how bad the letter is, and he censors out anything he sees fit, anything he thinks might be a code, anything that, was on the list that I showed earlier, any of that. And then once he is done censoring everybody's mail in the unit, he puts it in a bag. And then that bag gets brought to a rear area by a runner, by the unit if they're leaving the line, by another unit that's leaving the line, however it gets back to a supply depot. But it gets back there, and then it gets put on a truck or a train and sent to a port city on the channel. So Calais would be a good one, Dunkirk would be a good one, one of those two. And then it would be shipped across the channel with 19,000 bags of mail a day. Not pieces of mail, bags of mail. Just an impossible amount of mail being shipped to and from every single day. And then it gets sent to a mail center specifically designed for military mail. It is here that suspicious letters from, secret places, letters that seem suspicious, letters pulled from, just a random draw will get pulled aside and then sent to a different second round of screening. It is here that you have 4,000 civilian workers sitting at desks all day, reading people's letters, deciding, is this suspicious? Is this checked? Is this, just a random thing that was pulled? The honor envelopes also get sent here, and they will decide, should that letter be sent home or not? And if the letter clears them, then it gets sent to another mail center where hopefully it catches back up to the other mails that it was sent with. And then it gets distributed like normal and it gets home. Now, you also have the field post letters that kind of skip this point. They just go straight back home. It's great. The most insane part about this entire process is that it takes like 2 to 3 days for a letter to get back home. It is wild. They had this down to an art. If you made a letter and you gave it to your CO, it would be home within almost a week. If it gets to the supply depot, it'll be home within like 2 to 3 days. It is fascinating just how fast these letters get from one point to its designated point. I ordered something off eBay. It took 2 weeks for it to get in. It's insane. And the amount of mail that they are dealing with too is also just an incomprehensible amount. We are talking not pounds, not hundreds of pounds, but tons, literal tons of mail every single day. And they're not just censoring their soldiers' mail, they are censoring civilians' mail being sent back to the soldiers. They are censoring POWs' mail being sent back to their home nations. They are censoring everything. Now, going back the other way, you have the civilian, which self-censors. Then they send it to the mail office. The mail office sends it to the censorship office. The censorship office either, lets it go through or they destroy it. If it goes through, it gets sent to a mail depot, then to a supply depot, then to a port across the channel to another supply depot, then to the front line where it's distributed. Same process going back the other way. Now, other nations had slightly different ways of screening. The Germans were a lot more restrictive about what was sent, not just from the front line, but to the front line. And they really put the hurt on what they censored and didn't censor, especially in 1917 when Germany was going through just incredible amounts of food riots, and anybody that was inside of a city was dealing with some form of hunger. They would censor almost every letter that came through going to the front, because if the frontline soldiers hear about their families and how they just had their, younger brother die of starvation, they're not going to want to fight, and that would bottom out your war support. And then you also have the United States on the other side that doesn't censor mail coming to the troops at all. You have Britain and France and Germany that do censor mail going to the front. The United States says, no, we're good. And if you send a letter, you can talk about whatever you want, and it will get to France, sent to the person you're sending it to, completely uncensored. And then going back the other way, a United States soldier will write a letter, they'll self-censor, it'll get censored by their CO, and then it might go through another screening, but even then it was a lot more relaxed than other nations were, and that kind of deals with location of the US, the time of the war that we come into it, how unprepared we were. It's a couple different things. But overall, if you wanted to write a letter, the United States is where you want to do it at. And then you also have Italy and Austria-Hungary and Russia that also have their own mail systems. Every nation had some form of a censorship office and a mail system. And each one was a little different from the last. They each had their own little tweaks and things that made it niche. But overall, they were absolutely vital to the war effort and did their jobs so well. I can't even imagine how many letters a person must have read if they signed up in 1914 all the way through 1918. Just absolutely wild stuff. So that'll wrap it up for this episode of Censorship on Soldiers. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to catch you guys in the next one. See ya.